Now the in-between period, the interwars. So Dr. Bagdasarian is a retired surgeon with a deep love of history throughout his lifetime, and he enjoys presenting different perspectives on historical events. He says that he hopes to stimulate people to view history in a manner which illuminates current events and gets us past the superficial views presented by the media. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In a way, I'm going to start out with an apology, and that is because the direction of this particular set of lectures is a little bit less focused on events and is going to concentrate much more heavily on ideology and the impacts of ideology. And the reasons for these choices in presenting this set of lectures have to do with a transition that I had mentioned during my last set of lectures on the last 2 years of World War I, that is from 1917 and 1918. At that particular time, there was, in my view, a very distinct break in the way nations conducted their international affairs. Previously, nations competed in what I call power politics. That doesn't mean that ideologies had no role. It's just that the primary focus was on maintaining or balancing power or acquiring territories which were going to build on the power of the nation which took those territories. In 1917, two things happened which were of, to me, critical importance and essentially set the stage for the next 80 years, practically, if not further. We're beginning to shift back a little bit towards power politics in my own view now. But for the next 80 years, from 1918 all the way up to 1998, 99, ideology became a clear focus. And I hope to use the interwar years as an illustration of what happened then, explain to some degree why I think certain things happened, and then more particularly carry these things forward in examples of today. Some of the comments may strike people as either odd. I don't think you'll see them so much as offensive. They're not politically oriented, depending on how you wish to interpret them. But I think the formulation will bear fruit as we go through this. Now, the usual bog rules, all right? I'm not an expert. You're all muted except for my audience here, but they know that if they're going to fall asleep, they don't snore, they sleep in the back. And similarly, we'll take a 10-minute break at the end of hour one, but I'll remain here if people want to chit chat. And at the end, please let Lyceum know what's going on. This set of goals of lectures, I hope I will achieve during the course of the 8 hours. I need to know from all of you if you feel these have been achieved or where things may have gone off the rails. The emphasis is going to be less directly on military conflict, which had been a primary focus for the lectures that preceded this one. But they are important and they will be discussed, but more particularly, as I list in paragraph 4, the technology and doctrine, organization, even the strategy, all shows in a considerable change from what had preceded. And these, again, will tie into the ideological issues. Now, I'm going to start with a little bit of a review, but not a great review. The Russian Revolution in particular was one of the seminal events that completely transformed the nature of the world once it occurred. And we're going to discuss this in some detail. As you may recall, Tsar Nicholas, who was in the Romanov family, which had been ruling Russia for 300 years, was finally deposed because of his gross incompetence, both on the domestic and on the international stage. The people surrounding him, some of whom were reasonably capable, still could not refrain from the intense infighting that was characteristic of his reign. And as a result, he and his family were, he abdicated and he and his family were captured as they attempted to get into exile and subsequently were murdered in July of 1918. The Russian government at that particular time underwent a profound change. It hadn't completely collapsed. Some of the gross structures of government remained, but within that government, there were a series of very radical factions, which not only found it hard to work together, but found it hard to govern at all. The Bolsheviks, particularly under Lenin, Trotsky was actually part of the Menshevist movement and did not join the Bolsheviks until somewhat later. And Kerensky, who had various posts within the government and within the Duma, had risen to a level of authority that once the Tsar left, he became the effective president of the Russian Republic. Unfortunately for Kerensky, he was caught in a sense between a rock and a hard place. He was trying to continue the war because he felt that the Russian obligations to the Allied powers, France and Britain in particular, were of critical importance. And he was hoping to protect the, we'll call it the Soviet Mother Russia, it wasn't Soviet at the time, but Mother Russia, from further incursions by the Germans. And due to an offensive, which carries his name, the Kerensky Offensive in 1917, which turned out to be an almost unmitigated disaster. Kerensky now was forced in a real problem with a coup attempt in July of 1917. The coup attempt was conditioned almost spontaneously by uprisings in Petersburg, which was the capital of Russia at the time. As a result, Kerensky called for General Kornilov, who was one of the major generals in charge of the armies on the front, to come to Petersburg and help quell this coup. Lenin attempted to use the coup to actually get rid of Kerensky. When the coup was suppressed, Lenin had to flee to Finland. As Kornilov moved up towards Petersburg, word came that Kornilov was going to displace Kerensky and establish a military dictatorship. So Kerensky called Lenin back, in a sense, putting a wolf in the hen house in order to keep out the fox. And as a result, the whole system collapsed. In October, the Bolsheviks led a nearly bloodless coup to drive out the government, Kerensky's government. He headed into exile, and to take over the reins of government. Now, what he did was something that was almost unique in world history. He didn't just take the reins of the existing government and put in people to run it. If we think about how we go through an election and a new administration comes in, we get new cabinet officers, they run different departments, you can run, but all of that deeper infrastructure remains fairly stable and consistent. Lenin wasn't doing that. He was basically dismantling the government and recreating a new government. Now, many of the names persisted in terms of Minister of Foreign Affairs and things of this sort. But what he was doing, more importantly, was he was using the names to create a semblance of connection to the structure of government, but fundamentally was altering it beyond recognition. There's even a story that Trotsky, who became the Minister of Foreign Affairs, if you will, walked into his new office and wasn't recognized by anybody there, and they wouldn't listen to him until he basically forced them to accede to his authority. In addition, shortly after, because of the unsettled nature of what was going on in Petersburg, they literally moved the government to Moscow. And when they did that, think again, files, cabinets, all of the rest of this paper that's accumulated over decades and decades, what are you doing with it? And to a large degree, they left a lot of it behind, because what they were going to do was recreate a brand new system of government. So we need to keep this in mind, because the turmoil that exists over the coming nearly decade until Stalin establishes himself really as the sole ruler in about 1928, is at this time still dealing with this chaos that existed throughout Russia at the time. Now, I mentioned this slide because one of the things that was of critical importance to Lenin, who in a true sense of the word was the philosophic guide for the establishment of Bolshevik Russia, later named Communist Russia. He was not just George Washington, right? And even though Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels had written Das Kapital, and there's always the connections back to them as the founders of Bolshevism, it was really Lenin's true brilliance in establishing the foundations of communism and incorporating it in reality into the Russian government that is extraordinary. And his particular dominance in the political organization is something that we just have to accept and understand. It goes well beyond anything that our country has ever experienced. It is not too far removed from the concepts of, say, Louis XIV, God and my right. That is, that I am not just the supreme leader, I am the foundation of the truth of what we're headed for. And if we don't keep that particular thing in mind, all the conflicts that happen throughout Russia for the next 10 plus years will not be clear to us. It also will stand in very clear distinction from what was happening in what we call the West, that is primarily France, Britain, and the United States. In order to secure his position, one of the things Lenin had to do was to reach peace with Germany. The army had basically dissolved through 1917. And it was at this point that Lenin felt the only way to save the revolution was to establish peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And as he did this, it cost Russia enormously in terms of territory, even population, and resources, because it reshaped the power structures in all of these regions. And you see it highlighted in this map in the sense that this red area in particular was basically ceded to Germany with this peace treaty, and other sections, including Finland and good portions of the Ukraine, were now considered autonomous. This nearly cost Lenin the revolution, but at the same time, it permitted him to consolidate his political grip and to use, particularly Trotsky, to rebuild the Red Army for what was coming, which Lenin knew was coming, which was there was going to be a civil war. This now became an issue of dominance. In addition to this, Russia not only now was confronting Germany, which had taken over substantial territories, but the Allies were, in a literal sense, invading Russia. And in particular, the area in the north, up here where the Brits came in order to technically protect the supplies, thousands of tons of supplies that had been accumulated to support Russia in fighting Germany, and all the way to the Far East in Vladivostok. But there was also an incursion by Britain into the Black Sea area and up towards Baku, which is at the base of the Caspian Sea because of its oil reserves. Britain had always been touchy about the Middle East. And this was one of the things that happened. So the Allies literally were invading Russia. From Lenin's perspective, what he also saw was these incursions were bolstering the opposition to his own government. That is, and we'll come to this about the whites and the reds. If we don't remember this, then we will forget the intense, pervasive paranoia that was existing in Russia through this time frame, and which continued basically all the way up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This paranoia was intense and profound and pervasive. Now, don't try to read this slide. I'm going to break it down in a later section, all right? And I deliberately kept the font small. But the idea behind this is the following. As early as 1919, when Lenin is trying to consolidate his power, his grip on the political organization, and to rebuild his government, what assumed the greatest importance was the party. It was not an issue that was directly related to any geographic boundary that one would look at. This was the ascendancy of the party over everything. And without the party being dominant, Lenin did not feel there was any possibility for the utopia. And I use that word intensely. The utopia he sought to come to fruition. These outlines, these 21 theses, outline the kind of discipline that was going to be present throughout the 20s and 30s. And why did this create such an important element? Because Stalin felt equally that these particular principles had to exist, not just for his survival, but for the survival of the ideology. And we'll come to that further as we go along. Now, just to give you a quick idea of what's showing here. And if you think that Lenin was just a kind, gentle old soul, there you have it. All right. Hang, I mean publicly, 100 kulaks. The definition of kulak could be that if you owned a horse and a couple cows. This was not our big agrarian farm entities that we have out in the Midwest, all right? So the idea was you have to institute terror. You have to make people understand at a visceral level the power of the state, the power and authority of the party. Any opposition to this should be met unequivocally with harshness. And there are other similar actions that he was taking to the intelligentsia, for example. Now, Lenin dies in 1926, I believe it was. He had a stroke in 24, and then I think it was 2 years later that he finally died. And there's a critical juncture in the history of Russia at this time, and that is the difficulty of who was going to follow Lenin. Lenin, in his own writings, basically not quite hated everyone, but felt that there was no one who was capable of fitting his shoes. Now, you need that kind of narcissism in order to achieve the extraordinary things which Lenin was able to achieve. But at the same time, you're not going to live forever. And during the course of Lenin's career, when the Russian Civil War was breaking out and continuing and creating all manner of misery, two major people were considered to be those of the highest rank below Lenin. Trotsky on the left and Stalin on the right. These two would have a bitter contest right from the beginning of when Trotsky joined the Bolshevik Party. And the contest between himself and Stalin was formulated around the ability to be Lenin's true legacy. And how Stalin came to win that is an important lesson for us, but I want to just point that out here. Now, what about the Russian Civil War? The first thing to remember is that Russia had been fighting since 1914 against the Germans and Austria-Hungary. They had lost millions. The expense to the country had been huge. The insufficiencies of the infrastructure to conduct the war were at least some of the causes for Tsar Nicholas to be deposed, forced to abdicate, and eventually murdered. But the Russian Civil War now breaks out almost without a break. And as a result, there is enormous conflict that takes place throughout Russia. So more cost, more devastation, added to a country's already weak infrastructure and poor financial setup. How anyone survived this is almost beyond comprehension, quite seriously, much less find the resources to carry on this conflict. Now, this particular slide shows that Finland, Poland, and part of Ukraine are considered autonomous. And the yellow structure shows how the Bolsheviks just controlled a relatively small portion of the entirety of Russia. Remember, it goes all the way to the Far East, all the way out to the Pacific. You're seeing only a central section that is enclosed. And much of that important section that would keep Russia viable is not in their hands at this point. Plus, they're being attacked from three sides. How is it that they're able to survive this kind of conflict? Well, let's just look quickly at who the participants are. The whites are often lumped together, but really in terms of the actual Civil War, it's sort of like whites 1, whites 2, whites 3. And as was happening within the initial turmoil of the Russian government under the Bolsheviks, a lot of internal dissension and difficulty, none of these three major groups cooperated with each other. They communicated, but they rarely got their act together. And there were several reasons for it. One is that people like Denikin, who had been a Tsarist officer, wanted to restore the monarchy, even though the Romanovs had now been killed off. Others wanted to increase their autonomy, have a separate region under their own particular control. As a result of this, they couldn't act together with a clear political goal that they could use to convince the rural population, much less the urban populations, that siding with them was in their best interest. I mean, think about it. One of the things that I mentioned in the last set of lectures was Lenin's slogan for the poor. Peace, that's the peace with Germany. Bread and land. Now, that he didn't deliver well on two of them is beside the point. But the whites did not have anything comparable. So when the rural population was literally being overrun by these armies that are coming through villages and saying, we need to feed our soldiers. Where is your grain? Where are your oats? What other products do you have we can take? And if you resist, then you have shown us that you are on the side of the Bolsheviks, and we're happy to shoot you. Yes.
Why is it called
Oh, why is it called the whites? No, that's right, I got it. Because the idea was to separate in terms of their flags, if you will, something that was more in line with the imperial flags that had existed with the Romanovs. So like most things, when you have the Reds who were waving the red flag of rebellion and had their symbol on it and so on, what you're doing here is you're drawing a distinction, and you want that distinction to be as clear as possible. A black flag, that doesn't signal something good, okay? And they weren't about to get something like the, the red, white, and blue, or something very complicated. So they needed something that visually was very clear and separate. Okay. Now, other participants, for example, Semyonov, he says, oh, I'm way out in the east. I'm going to have my own Mongol state. And remember, religiously too, these were distinctly different areas. Because in the Western Russia, you had a much more Christian-oriented population. But as you move to the Central Asia and to the farther east, you tended to have a Muslim population, or one that had been strongly influenced by Chinese. Okay. In addition, he was able to fight for almost 2 years, but he's eventually defeated, as you see, in 1920. Kolchak, who is more in the western side, but he's, if you think of it, west of the Urals, he's in European Russia. He is going to try to take over and defeat the Reds, but he doesn't like Denikin. And Semyonov is sort of, I'll take care of him once things are done. So when these people are working, while they initially are successful, they end up falling apart, and in a sense, they're defeated in detail. And as you'll see at the bottom, he gets defeated in 1919 and is shot as a result. Another general, this is in the Cossack region. If you think about the Donbass, if you think about the southern Ukraine regions, Crimean region, and so on. Again, they had a different culture, a different ethnic identity. This particular gentleman, hardly actually applicable to him in terms of his personal behavior, but that's neither here nor there, went on to try to work with Denikin, but at the same time, his cooperation was very limited. He had his own agenda. And again, this meant that there was no united construct which would lead them against the Reds. Alexeyev, yet another general who was involved. He was more in the northern section. He didn't last quite as long, and as you can see, died of heart failure in 1918, at which point the Brits basically said, we're going to get out of this fight. Let's just leave, as did the United States and France. Not Japan right away. They liked what they were gaining. Still another one. I mention these not because I expect anyone to remember them, but the idea that you had all of these, actually, many of these were czarist officers initially at the top tier who have the most experience in how to conduct warfare and are able to continue these fights, but within a year or two, many of them are defeated, either fled or have been killed. What about on the side of the Reds? Most of these people that you're going to see in the next couple of slides are not senior officers. Indeed, a number of them came from very mediocre or even lower class backgrounds. They were junior officers in the Tsarist army, but when that began to crumble, found themselves identifying with the Bolsheviks and eventually becoming prominent leaders in the Bolshevik, the Red Army, and then over the next decades rose to senior ranks and will become some of the most important senior officers during World War II, Zhukov being probably the one that some of you may have heard of. Voroshilov, another one, who had both a political basis and a close cooperation with Stalin, and worked with him closely through many years of development, but also became a very important person in the Red Army and the Soviet Army once it was fully developed. This is an interesting character. I mentioned Franz because even though he was relatively young, you'll see he died at 40. And you say to yourself, well, okay, big deal. The guy didn't last that long. Why do we care about him? Just as we have West Point, Russia has the Franz Institute. This is the school of highest learning in the military. So it's even more than West Point, though it has a basis there. It's more like the War College at Leavenworth or at Newport for the Navy. This is a fellow who reached deeply into understanding military doctrine and inculcated this into his junior officers during the Russian Civil War and promoted the distribution of that doctrine and understanding throughout the Red Army. And even though he died young and died during surgery for a ruptured appendix, I'm sorry, yes, for an ulcer. It was thought that he may have been thought to be a challenge to Stalin. There's some question that Franz didn't want to have the surgery. He said, listen, I'll live with my ulcer or whatever. No, you got to get it fixed, and then died in the recovery time. It's an interesting speculation that we have no answer to. Now, this fellow, Tukhachevsky, again, he was a young man at the time the war is breaking up. He's literally in his 20s, okay, if you look at it. And he became one of the most prominent officers in the Red Army during the course of the Civil War and led a substantial portion of the Red Army during their subsequent war with Poland. And then developed the doctrines of armored warfare for the Russian army during the interwar years. He dies in 1937, and I'm going to just take a little tangent here because Stalin saw him and a whole number of other officers within the Red Army as a threat to him. He thought they might be planning a coup. So he had Tukhachevsky executed along with 37,000 officers in 1937. Okay. All right. Timoshenko works closely with Stalin, fights with him at a critical battle at a city called Tsaritsyn, which subsequently was named Stalingrad and is now named Volgograd on the Volga River. And he managed to navigate through all of the idiocies that existed during the 20s and 30s and became a very important officer in the Red Army. Now, I conclude the issue on the Russian Civil War by just showing these two slides. And again, the slides themselves, difficult to read, that's not the intent. What I want you to look at is all these swirling arrows that you see. And this reflects the back and forth of what was going on in the Russian Civil War. And if you look at the center portion, you'll see that in the center portion, it's really a small geographic slice of the entirety of Russia. The Bolsheviks were pushed into that small geographic area at one point during the Russian Civil War, and yet they emerged victorious. Again, an incredible accomplishment at enormous cost to the Russian people and the Russian landowners, to the wealth of the nation. The green arrow is showing where the Entente powers entered in order to assist the whites. They wanted to keep Russia in the fight against Germany. And then they had great fear over the Bolsheviks. And we'll see how that comes to play later on. and then eventually withdrew. And this shows more of the enormity of Russia and where the Japanese and others entered Russia in an attempt to maintain their control, not just over supplies, but to assist the whites in trying to defeat the Bolsheviks. In other words, even in 1918, 1920, the Bolsheviks were seen as an international threat. And again, we'll talk about that as we go forward. Now, the Bolsheviks become communists. And again, I just put these two up to show you the prime characters. What happened in this particular situation and what did the transformation truly mean? Lenin, as I said, had established preeminence in the Bolshevik Party. He had restructured government. He was essentially almost solely responsible for senior appointments. Nobody got a good job in the government without Lenin's approval. His dedication to his work, to understanding all of the different complexities that existed in any society, particularly a society that was struggling to go from a predominantly rural system of economy into a more modern system. These were things which only a brilliant person could manage. The complexities, the amount of detail, the writings, the communications that he had to continue with so many different people over such a huge geographic area was astounding. And on top of that, he had to be able to pick leaders who could accomplish what he wanted. And those leaders, in their own way, had to be brilliant. If they were not, things would fall apart. I mention this because as we look at the enormous complexity of our current world, and we think back almost 100 years, when the world seems simpler when we look back, all right? But it was hardly simple. Well, the complexity is such that unless you have people of great talent, energy, and ability, it's all going to collapse, or it's going to funnel down to other people who will say, we're not getting the kind of direction from the top that we need, or that direction is taking us in a bizarre place. So we are going to make those decisions. Lenin did not permit that. He kept a tight, close watch on everybody. And just think about a 24-hour day. How much time can you really spend doing a lot of this, all right? It had to be handwritten in many ways and communicated. Trotsky had no military background, but he organized the Red Army in such a manner and directed its actions in such a manner that in many ways, the success of the Reds during the Civil War, when you saw how they had been constrained from several different sides into a small geographic area, this man pulled it off. He had the charisma and the energy and the organizational talent to put things together. He traveled thousands and thousands of miles in a armored train so he could go to all the various areas and work with the commanders and get things done. But he is also, in his own way, a very brutal person, because from his perspective, as from Lenin's perspective, remember, the thing that mattered was the party, the success of the revolution. This was actually not as much about Russia or the proletariat, though that was often used as the excuse for doing what was done. And it certainly had little to do, as we'll see later on, with the rural population. Bolshevism was directed towards the urban poor and underclass, not to the rural population. We tend to think that's wrong. And then you go back, well, what about Lenin's slogan? Lenin knew he needed the cooperation of peasants in order to get grain and other things they needed to conduct the war. Horses, all the rest of it, food, meat, whatever. So he knew he could co-opt them by offering something which he was going to take back later on. Only he didn't live long enough to institute it. But that's where this other guy comes in, Stalin. Now, many times people see some of these leaders, Stalin being among them, as though they're ignorant buffoons. Here's a guy from a little country called Georgia down in the Caucasus. He's raised in part in a seminary school, and then he ends up joining the Bolsheviks early on. He gets sent off into exile into Siberia on a couple of occasions. He becomes a thug, truly, robbing banks and other things in order to get money for the revolution. But what is missed is, again, that this man was extraordinarily well read. He was extraordinarily competent. And he became Lenin's sort of surrogate on many occasions because Lenin knew how closely tied Stalin was to Lenin's own philosophy. Now, there's a famous letter that Lenin wrote that's often referred to as the Testament, in which, because of Lenin's deterioration after his stroke, he now had to face the issue of who could replace him. And without naming anyone in particular, he criticized most of those who were close to him, who might have assumed that they would be targeted as the person to replace him. Lenin characterized Stalin as rude. Now, we can take that in a couple of different ways. Rude, rough-edged, maybe not well-educated, certainly not of high intelligence, rude in that old terminology, but rude also personally, that he was rude to a lot of other people. But Stalin wrote an enormous amount and communicated closely with a number of Bolshevik leaders throughout the nation, throughout the country, and particularly was close to Lenin. So that when the push came to shove, Stalin was able to manipulate the administrative organization of the Bolshevik government into such a way that it now became truly communist in origin and nature, and he could push Trotsky aside. One of the interesting readings that come out of government archives in Russia is how argumentative everybody was. And sometimes we think that the language we use or hear our political elites use towards each other is rather harsh. We would be considered rather courteous compared to how they described each other in open session, in speeches. They could be verbally brutal towards each other. But because of the political allegiances that existed, there was nothing absolute in terms of who could control the levers of power. What you had to do was maneuver in the political arena in such a way that you could put your opponent at a strong disadvantage. So if we think of it in terms of something like this, it's not a great analogy. I just want you to sort of toss it around in your heads. So we have Roosevelt as president of the United States in World War II, and then we have MacArthur, okay, and Eisenhower. And you're thinking, who's going to take over from Roosevelt? Is it going to be MacArthur or Eisenhower kind of thing, or is it going to be somebody else? And MacArthur and Eisenhower are working diligently to undermine each other to the point they hope that one of them will get the nod and get promoted to that final ascendancy of presidency. Well, again, within our own framework, it's easy to say, well, no, you have to go through political parties, you have to build your coalitions, you have to have that, and you're certainly not going to, brutalize your opponent. Well, Stalin in 1928 finally has the political power sufficiently behind him that he's able to exile Trotsky. Doesn't have him killed outright. That doesn't happen until 1940, when he arranges for him to be murdered, because Trotsky was still writing and preaching against Stalin and against the now Soviet Union in that period of time. So Stalin was an amazing character. He also was what we would probably call a sociopath, in the sense that, as was true of a number of leaders, and I think Lenin could be included in this, is that the individual didn't matter, right? If I had to kill you, I killed you. I mean, that's just the way things go, because I'm working to a greater good. But it is a real mistake to underestimate the talent, the true brilliance of these people, and the risks they took personally, where they could be killed. They certainly were sent on a number of occasions to Siberia in exile for years, and so on. And they did not, these primary leaders were not looking to make themselves wealthy. They were looking to control the levers of power. What they had was primarily owned by the state. It wasn't personal wealth. So if we look around the world today and see how other dictators have functioned, despite whatever ideological basis they claim, many of them are simply trying to accrue wealth. And they use that wealth to get them out of Dodge when the time comes. Okay, all right. Again, lessons for us. I put this slide up now, even though this is 1928, because I want to demonstrate the depths of the problems that Russia faced at this particular time frame. All right, now, without getting into the economy too much, all right, look at this, between July and September, okay, loss of 145 million rubles, and that shouldn't be an apostrophe S, I'll fix that. All right, wealth of gold, and 10 million of other metals. In other words, remember, there was still the gold standard. So the valuation of your money couldn't be handled just by printing money and hoping for the best. We'll see how they tried that in Germany and it didn't work. Their foreign exchange reserves, 330 billion. You're talking only a few months of reserves before you're out of money. Okay. External debt is already greater than your reserves. Now, a couple of things that Stalin did during the 20s as he became general secretary and then struggled against Trotsky until he finally got rid of him in 28. One of the things Stalin did was that he made some gross economic errors. One was that at the time he wished to modernize the Russian economy, he was facing a serious reduction in the harvesting of grains. The production level in Russia, as a consequence of the Civil War in particular, but then accentuated markedly by the collectivization and the demonization of kulaks, those successful farmers who had a cow or two or a horse and so on, completely undercut the ability to export grain as a form of trade. So it meant they had less money available to import machinery to modernize their agricultural system. And that was the goal of collectivization. The idea was with big farms, we can get machinery. You can't give a machine to a guy who owns, 5 acres and, a couple cows and a horse or so. He's going to plow that with his horse. But if I have 1,000 acres or 10,000 acres, then I need machines to make that work. So I have to have the grain to export, unless my gold reserves are going to disappear altogether. But the grain production plummeted markedly, partly as a result of collectivization and partly as a result of drought, poor harvests, and a variety of other things. Similarly, if you're a foreign government, and remember, this is before the crash, you're sitting pretty well, right? You're rebuilding your economy, you're producing, particularly Britain, France, the United States, right? And you're saying, do I want to loan money to Russia? First of all, I'm a little uneasy about Bolshevism and what that's going to mean, and we'll come to that later. But in particular, can they repay what they owe us? France, in particular, was owed a great deal of money by Russia. And Lenin had said, we're not paying you. So why would you invest? Stalin continued that same line of thinking. We're not paying you, but loan us money. Don't think so. Okay. So they had begun already to insulate themselves from foreign investments through their own actions. The collectivization, just look at what happened here. 5 million people, they basically displaced them off their farms. They didn't just take their property away, they took them away. And they said, well, now we're going to have collective farms in Central Asia. Guess where you're headed? You're going there. Look at the drop in the number of horses. You need horses to plow the fields. You're down by half. Cattle, down by half. Pigs, down by half. Sheep, down by 2/3, right? The suffering is so severe that in the so-called red famine era that exists into the 30s, 5 to 7 million people die. There's stories of cannibalism and selling children and all the rest of it to try to get through this, eating the bark off trees, all of this. No cats or dogs are around, and even the rats are getting a little bit scarce because people are going to eat anything if they can. What saved them? Yes.
Is the decline of horses and livestock directly related to the collectivization?
No. No, the decline in horses and other livestock that you see is not due solely to collectivization. A lot of that is due to the destruction of the Civil War itself. If you're an army coming through and you need to feed people, you're not worried about the next generation of sheep or cattle. You got to feed your troops now or there's going to be hell to pay. And there was often, by the way. So you just grabbed what you could. And therefore you didn't have enough to be able to create the next generation.
More the war was a direct.
Yes. But then if you're a farmer, okay, and you know that the local commissar is going to come to your farm and say, you had 2 cows, and now you've got 2 calves. We're going to take them. You're going to say, well, wait a minute. So either I get those calves away or I slaughter them myself soon so they don't show up. All right, then I go hide the meat somewhere because you got to feed your family. Right? See, that's the reality. You think about if you're living in your home and some guy from the municipal office downtown knocks on your door and says, I want to look in your pantries and I'm going to take all this stuff. What am I supposed to eat? Well, that's your problem. And that in a sense, in a simple way, was to think about it. What saved Stalin rather paradoxically, was the Great Depression. Because the country was already in such a poor state that when the Depression came, and I'm really simplifying, okay, Western businesses in part had a problem because they had large inventories. But with the collapse of the market, due to a lot of different things, purchasing power in the Western countries diminished. So how do I sell my products? I got to sell them somewhere. I sit in a warehouse, I'm getting nothing. Maybe I'll even be willing to take a bit of a loss if necessary, just to get rid of this stuff. At the same time, then I'm going to fire workers and do all of this other stuff, which further causes more difficulty in collecting the revenues you need to keep going. Think about the job losses that occurred with COVID. Okay. Think now that a lot of businesses are saying, if you're not vaccinated, you can't work for me. So those are people you were paying, people who pay taxes and people who go out and shop, right? They buy your products. Henry Ford learned that way back, that you pay better wages so the workers making these cars can actually own them. And just to give you another very quick statistic, around this time, the United States was estimated to have 20 million cars. Russia, 5,500. So when you look at this kind of dynamic and you start preventing businesses from either hiring people for whatever reason, now you've got a lot of people who are making zero money and are dependent on the state for whatever can be given to them, right? But from Stalin's standpoint, we're already down at the bottom of the heap here. So if you'll sell us that product for 30% of what you were going to charge, and you just need to get rid of it, it's like having a yard sale, right? Just get rid of the stuff. So I have some money I can use for whatever. That turned out to be a boon for him. Okay. Now, we're approaching 2 o'clock. So what I suggest we do is take our break, right? And anyone who has questions, feel free. I've glossed over an enormous amount of information. And I actually, and I mean this sincerely, I deeply apologize for how chaotic this all is going to sound. But it is fundamental to understanding the 20s and 30s and how World War II came to be, all right? Perhaps unlike World War I, which in my own judgment was a war that did not have to happen, but because the leaders of the various nations were not up to par, not up to what was required by circumstances, the difference in World War II is the lines are being drawn now. And these lines will eliminate the possibilities of compromise because they're going to raise the stakes from just power politics to something entirely different. Okay, thank you. See you in about 10 minutes. Yeah, wild applause. Of you on Zoom, the bathroom's right around the corner if you can get it in 10 minutes. It's a quick drive. Okay, we'll ask you to take your seats.
You're
And,
going to organize, you're going to show us an organized world,
oh, this is phenomenal. Here's where I get into ideology and philosophy and less an issue of events. But again, as I tried to mention at the beginning of these lectures, there's something to me fundamental about this period of time, which utterly transforms international politics and has a great influence as well on domestic politics in different areas. So I want to cover this because the importance to me is fundamental to even understanding what happened in World War II. Now, one of the things to also recognize is how the world was changing. There was an enormous restructuring, not just of political boundaries, but of the populations that existed in the world itself, as well as the various economic principles that were being utilized throughout the world. I mentioned this and I showed this on the last slide, the last lecture, because I think it captures fundamentally what is happening in the 20s and 30s. And unfortunately, in my own personal belief, I think is happening now. I won't read it out loud to you, but I think it is as expressive as anything can be about this period of time in the world. It's reflected in the art and the music as well, and in theaters and movies. If you look back in those periods of time and see what's being depicted, and we look at what's happening nowadays and how these transformations mirror. They're not exact replicas, but they mirror many of the fundamentals. The new Europe reconstructed here just fundamentally changed geographically due to the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which I called the sort of second sick man of Europe. In my last lectures, the Ottoman Empire was considered the sick man of Europe, and the Ottoman empires disappeared. And indeed, what we now see as modern Turkey was still under enormous threat and occupied by various groups, particularly the Greeks, even the French, even the Italians to some degree, and resulted in enormous difficulty. Poland is now recreated after nearly a century of basically being absent from the map as a distinct political entity. Czechoslovakia, brand new. Hungary, shortened. Austria, now basically a particle of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These kinds of changes also are reflected in what we saw in the Baltic states. And remember, this is after the finish of the war, and new treaties and boundaries are drawn. Now, here's an interesting set of statistics that I like to show to people, because it demonstrates something very particular about the human species, not just about the world in a simple statistical analysis. 5 to 10,000 years ago, 5 million. 1,000 years ago, 250. 1804, 1 billion. 1900 to 2000. 1.6 billion to 6 billion? But we talk about World War I and II and the pandemic and the current COVID stuff and all the rest of this as though the world's population should have gone way down. The escalation in number is extraordinary. Look at the urban population. Look at the global economic output. Some of you may remember a term called the Malthusian cycle or crisis, where a population in a locale grows to such an extent that it overtakes the resources available to sustain that population, and that population collapses. That hasn't happened. Why? Grain production rose 5 times. Energy use, all in the 20th century. This is extraordinary. Never has anything like this happened in human history ever before. But it comes with challenges. Now, looking after the war, after World War I, and seeing what the populations were like in 1939, it begins to demonstrate that in spite of all the things that we've discussed over the last set of lectures, even this preliminary lecture here, the populations were growing. How is that possible? This is something, again, very particular to human beings. Capitalism, dominant social and economic system. That doesn't mean that other systems didn't exist. But in terms of those changes that I showed on the earlier slides, it is this particular economic system located particularly in Western Europe and in the United States, Canada, and so on, that takes over and creates an economic basis on which that population could be sustained, those resources gathered, productivity increased enormously. Now, I already alluded to the Depression. I'll come back to that at another time, but here's a phrase that I think is particularly important. Without inequity, capitalism cannot work. Not will not work, cannot. Think about that for a moment and think about the implications that that carries with it. Because what we see and hear about many times nowadays, and I don't mean just in our country, but we see this happening more and more globally, is this concept of equity. And the great and to some extent well-deserved criticisms of the increasing division between the very wealthy and the poor. So you have a Bezos and you have Zuckerberg and you have Soros and you have all these other people whose wealth is extraordinary, almost incomprehensible. And yet the foundation of capitalism in some ways looks at that and says, what did you expect? Okay. Bezos and Zuckerberg and others got their money by selling a product that people wanted to buy. And they were willing to pay for it. Nobody forced them to buy it. If you wanted, you don't want it, Facebook, you don't buy it. All right, you don't want to use Amazon, you don't. You're not obligated. So they're offering something which people look at and say, gee, how did he come to have so much wealth? At the same time, it's because we kept buying his products. Think about how Bill Gates got started or how companies like Hewlett Packard and others. I mean, they literally were garage organizations, right? So keep that in mind. Now, Karl Marx's, one of his major philosophic points, and he made some that were truly excellent points, and we'll discuss them a little bit later, is he expected employers to cut wages to increase profits. But the very next statement demonstrates what capitalism learned as it shifted from purely an idea of producing. Let's take the coal mines in Pennsylvania as an example of the abuse that could occur, right? So many tons of coal, and I don't care what happens to you, right? If you get injured, tough. Leave the community, I'm going to get a new worker. And if you need supplies, you're going to buy them at my company store, right? You impoverish your own workers. But Henry Ford realized if I don't impoverish my own workers, they can buy cars. So you can have any color you want as long as it's black, okay? But the point is that everybody can own one. You don't have to be rich to own it. Marx didn't understand that. And that was a fundamental concern for the Bolsheviks because Lenin was a disciple of Marx, although he modified many of the issues related philosophically to it. And Stalin was a disciple of Lenin. And they fundamentally had to come to grips with this. Now, what were the dominant ideologies? And I'm simplifying enormously. All right. We're going to talk about these not necessarily in this particular sequence, but I just want to present these because each of these has some fundamental offerings to their particular populations, which made them successful. But ultimately, for some of them, led to a road of destruction. And that doesn't mean all of them can't lead to a road of destruction, nor does it mean of their particular philosophy, they were going to end up destroying themselves as well as others in the process. As we come to some of the fundamentals, the question is, when do you stop? When is enough kind of thing? Now, I mention this because you'll see where this comes from. This comes from Livy, 59 BC to 17 AD. Now, I mention this, and I'm not going to read it to you because you'll read faster than I can anyway. But the idea behind this is that Livy is saying something fundamental about human nature. And unless one can understand and accept certain realities, at least from my own perspective, my own bias of human nature, we cannot truly understand the impact and importance of ideology and how it drives not just ourselves, but it drives communities, societies, governments, international politics. This is another issue that, again, it goes on from Livy. And one of the things that is really important here, the life and morals of the community and the men and qualities by which through domestic policy and foreign wars, dominion was won and extended. The idea here is that ideology often carries with it an impetus to be promoted elsewhere. Proselytizing is the word that many religious groups use, right? I have a truth, I'm going to go out, I'm going to go to places where this truth is not understood or even accepted. I'm going to be willing literally to put my life on the line for it, right? In order to demonstrate the value of this particular belief system, right? But as he mentions, slowly sinks, right? As the standard of morality lowers, right? Sinks into ruin. Again, the consequence of certain foundations. And again, we could get very philosophic about all of this, and to some extent we will as we move forward. But I just want this concept to be very clear as we go forward, because this is one of the most fundamental principles in which most of us in this country believe. Now, not everyone, right? And many people have distorted the terminology used here because they've taken the terminology out of context of the time in which it was written. But I'm going to parse this out because remember what Wilson did when he promoted his 14 points. What he was establishing in terms of a basis for achieving peace in the world, ending World War I, was he was basing those formulations, those 14 points, on the ideology that drove this country. He was attempting to meld a reality around this philosophy. Most of us are aware that the Constitution followed the Articles of Confederation, which was the original governing document of this country. And there was fierce debate over the foundation of what the Constitution was, whether it was even legal to adopt it, because the delegates sent to Philadelphia were given a specific charge to modify the Articles, not to create a new Constitution. Okay. But most of us also are only really aware of the Federalist Papers. We're not aware of those who argued against it, called the Anti-Federalists, which is a poor eponym to apply, but there it was. But the importance of both of these things, when you look at it carefully, is to understand how the formulation of the Constitution and the arguments that enforce the inclusion of the Bill of Rights stemmed from this. So I used the Declaration as the statement of the philosophy on which this country was founded. And the Constitution is the mechanism by which we realize this particular foundation. No other nation, to my understanding, ever put forth something like this prior to this existence. And therefore, it takes a little bit of time to look at. First is that it establishes the very principle by which a people can overturn a government and do so legitimately. All right. And as he says, should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. That we as a people have to justify to the world as well as to ourselves why we are able to do this, why this is a legitimate action. Very few others prior to this ever bothered to do that. Now, truths. Truth means immutable. Now, focus on that for a moment. If you have something that is true, anything which works against it or attempts to modify it is no longer true. Here's an example. Take the number 1. Can you change it and still have it be 1? You can put a decimal point in a million zeros, but if you add a 1 at the end, it's no longer 1. So there's a formulation in the idea of what truth means that pervades all ideologies and not just religions. So keep that in mind. This word was extraordinarily important. Self-evident didn't mean that it's obvious to all of us. It meant that it was evident within yourself as a human being. That in being created equal did not mean that we are all of equal height or weight or whatever. It meant that within us, as fundamental human beings, we have the desire for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which I translate at the time into a meaningful life. So if you have your life taken away from you, clearly you can't pursue a meaningful life and your liberty is of no consequence. But if you are alive and you cannot pursue a meaningful life, what is that life worth? If you have no liberty, what is that life worth? Now, remember, this is philosophy. It means that every human being everywhere through all time has within him these characteristics, these rights, as we use the term now. Now, what is fundamental about that is it means it directs all human behavior. If we don't recognize that concept, then all the constructs that occur afterward, the shaping of it by the Constitution or by other ideologies, Bolshevism, Nazism, fascism, militarism in Japan, and so on, those things, all right, all have to take this into account. And if they pervert it, there will be great difficulty within the society. And it's a truth. That means it can't be changed. Now, we also state to secure these rights. That's the primary function of government. To secure your life, your liberty, and your pursuit of a meaningful life. Now, within America at the time, this again was an extraordinary statement. Britain didn't allow this. This wasn't the concept of how societies work, nor was it true in France or Italy, or Italy was fragmented up the wazoo at that time. And nowhere else in the world was that defined as the principle of government function. So we in this country embrace something truly unique in human history and defined the primary purpose of government. Now, within the Constitution, we recognize that you can't have anarchy. So there had to be a consensus among the people that certain restrictions would be permitted, but they had to be permitted by the people, not imposed by government. So what do we have down there, right? Whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. You see? And the term absolute despotism doesn't mean absolute in the sense of a totalitarian. It means any despotism which restrains your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness beyond what you have agreed to as a people. Now, again, it'll sound political, but when we start having executive orders come out of an administration, and this goes back decades, I'm not just talking about now, all right? So I don't want people to get all upset about that. You go back decades, and when the administration, the executive branch issues mandates, where's the consent of the governed to that? So part of the turmoil that we're seeing rise up through our current situation over the last 30, 40 years has in part been due to a rising power of the executive branch at the expense of the governed. And indeed, we, the people, are supposed to be in charge of those things. So it's become an issue of a trend that we begin to see. And I will stay as another part of personal philosophy, that regardless of the governing agency, and we can talk about boards of directors, we can talk about municipalities on up, any organized group, those in charge tend to accrue more and more power to themselves unless they are restrained by their own participants. So again, human nature. This is one of the key things. And I feel that this particular description is vital to understanding what's going to be going on through the 20s and 30s. Now, here's another set of issues that are important. In part, some of this was even offered by President Wilson, particularly the third, the economy controlled by experts. In progressivism, one of the things that the early progressives felt very strongly about, and Wilson wrote about this even when he was a student at Princeton, is that the economy is so complicated and there's so much imbalance within capitalism between what's produced and what's sold and what's needed and what isn't needed, but is just superfluous that's produced and put out there, should be controlled by experts to the point where businesses are told, this is what you'll produce and how much. Now, he wasn't advocating owning the business, okay? So there's a different formulation involved there. But this was one of the things that he was seeking to remove some of the gross inequities. And if we think back through the 1880s, 90s, and into the early parts of the 20th century, they were rampant inequities. He was trying to fix that, okay? So the intentions were good, okay? All right, we know how good intentions often turn out. Exactly. All right, now, but when you do that, you stifle innovation. Because the concept of innovation and creativity is you will produce something you foresee as a need down the road, but haven't yet established as a necessity. How many of us, for example, grew up when there was no internet? I think it's all of us. We even had rotary phones, right? Now, can you conceive of living without access to the internet or having your smartphone? It's impossible. I could call somebody in China and it wouldn't cost me anything. I mean, that is not conceivable. So if your experts are thinking in the here and now and trying to fix the here and now, but they can't see down the road, then what happens? You don't innovate. Where do you get the capital to innovate, especially since a lot of it is going to fail? All right. I think it was Thomas Edison or someone said that, you know, all these patents he had or whatever, it's what, 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration, you know, that kind of thing. But if you stifle that by interfering in the economy, this is what's going to happen. Now, remember the slide that I showed about the destruction of the Russian economy. That is an example of the wars, right? No question about that. Big, big impact, but it was also a result of institutional policy that destroyed the initiatives. In fact, there was, I'm going to divert for a moment. Under Lenin, recognizing how the Russian economy was spinning into a downward spiral, and then passing on to Stalin, they wanted to implement something called the new economic policy, which is similar to what happened in China about 20 years ago, where they finally realized that central planning and all sounded good, but if you didn't have some private enterprise out there, you were going to end up in a world of hurt. Lenin was flexible enough, Stalin was flexible enough to want to put the new economic policy in play. So the kulaks, as they were called, owning a cow or two and a horse, started to produce more, because under that, they could sell their grain at a better market price than the state coming in and saying, this is how much I'll pay you. And not only this is what I'll pay you, you have to sell it to me for this price. Okay, so production started to go up. A lot of other factors entered into why it collapsed, but it's a key element to realize. Now, individuals lose importance in the eyes of the state. When we look at the population of the world, having gone up to 6+ billion by the year 2000, we begin to say, how many of these people are needed? We begin to lose our own sense of humanity, right? And again, to use another example from Stalin, at least alleged to Stalin, one man's death is a tragedy, that of a million a statistic. We can't, as individuals, comprehend that kind of number, that kind of suffering, even when it's right in front of us, okay? So within the concept of governmental organizations and policies, as we talked about, Tom, a little earlier when you talked about epidemiology and physician activity, the idea that epidemiologists look at numbers, a physician looks at a person, and they have different dynamics they bring into play. Okay, I showed this also during the last set of lectures because it emphasizes how we have shifted our thinking. This particular person, John Lennon, has been revered for a lot of good reasons, for his musical talent and so on. John Lennon himself, in an interview, maintained that this particular song, Imagine, was truly meant as a sort of communist manifesto, and that it would be easier for people to swallow if it came with a sugar pill. You know, remember that? It was a chitty chitty bang bang, spoonful of sugar and the medicine go down. All right. This allows you to look at something that we experience right today. It's an extraordinary thing. Now, how do we sum up some of these ideologies? Because we're going to get into the weeds a little bit more in the remaining part of this lecture. Sorry about this. I love this comment by Karl Marx because I think it says something so fundamental about what was trying to be accomplished in Russia, that we need to just remember this. All of the other tenets of communism, and I talked about Lenin's 21 Theses, and that's how to implement it, are built around a particular concept, just like we hold these truths to be self-evident. Here is another formulation that encapsulates this very complex ideology and philosophy. Abolish private property. Now, what does that mean? That means I can impose, because once there's no private property, who has control over the property? Not the people living there, but the government, because you are merely a placeholder. It's not yours, and I can supplant you. So if I get rid of all private property, I can maintain that you all own it. The way, for example, we're told that we own our national forests. But the BLM makes all the decisions about who can graze there and the timber that can be taken, and if there's any mining to be done. You and I don't get to decide that. Okay. So as an example, governments of necessity, practicality, if they abolish private property, will have to be in charge. There's no way to get around it. But does that mean you can pursue a meaningful life? Does that mean you have liberty if you can't own property? Because how else do you establish your unique position in life, right? If you're told, you know, your jacket's very nice and warm, and I get it, and it's bad weather, but she doesn't have one. So I'm going to take your jacket and give it to her. Now, I think you're a tailor, so you can make yourself another jacket. But that jacket you have is not yours to give. I decide it can be given. So again, if we think about that fundamentally, it has a lot to do with what's going to happen down the road. Now, I bring this back where it's a little more easily read. I'm not going to read it to you. I'll let you read it as we go. But the important part here is Lenin has formulated in his 21 Theses the preeminence of the party. This is not even a political boundary. Because what you'll notice as we go through this is that he reaches well beyond the political boundaries of Russia in 1919. He's talking about a universal. The trajectory of capitalism, as outlined by Marx, was that it would shift into socialism and then into communism. This was inevitable. This is what's called the dialectic, all right? This will happen. This is as true as water following gravity. You cannot deny it. Now, if you think about that as a reality, then everything that follows from it tends to make sense. That means that throughout the entire world, eventually communism must come into play. Now, I'll use an example which again may offend some people, but one of the key things that is talked about in Islam is the idea of what's called a global caliphate. Now, taken in its most benign form, it means that there can't be world peace until the world is united under Islam. That doesn't mean everyone has to practice or become a practicing Muslim, because non-Muslims can be accepted within the global community. But it does mean that one set of rules will basically determine how the world functions. Bolshevism has a very similar issue, driven by this incontrovertible truth that capitalism will end up being destroyed through socialism and then through communism. Even the American philosophy expressed in the Declaration of Independence specifically goes beyond our national borders. It doesn't mean all people are created equal only in the United States. This is a human condition. So it goes beyond that. And when Wilson was promoting the 14 points, he was promoting philosophy beyond our borders. He's saying this is how the world should work. So the contests that are arising are fundamentally based around these kinds of issues. Bolshevism sees the world trajectory in a particular way. This is the truth of what will happen. Whereas, at least from the United States perspective, we have a different way of seeing it. The Nazis and the fascists have yet a different way. Modifications. In a way, somewhat in between, interestingly. But you need not accept that. Now, the idea here is that everything has to be united, okay? They all have to be subjected to the rule of party leadership. This is not limited just to Russia. This is global. And as a result of the development of the Communist International in 1922, this formulation, this philosophy is built into a particular structure. Communist cells will be created throughout the world, everywhere, promoted by the understanding that the underclass is abused and limited in its abilities to achieve by the governing classes, and in particular by capitalism. And it has resonance everywhere, everywhere in the world. These organizations will start to form. They form in China, they form less powerfully in Japan because of the nature of their country and culture and government and so on. But there are powerful communist elements in the United States, France, Britain, Italy, Germany, all over. A little less so in South America, but there's, again, stirrings, if you will, that start there as well. So keep that in mind. This is a pervasive implementation through the Communist International, and it is directed by the party in Moscow. Now, if you think that they're all operating independently, what you have to realize is the Communist International would meet occasionally in Moscow with representatives from all around the world. And their idea was to promote the party line. This is what we want you to do. To jump well ahead, in 1939, when Russia signed the pact with Germany just prior to the outbreak of the war, August of 39, French communists were so upset that this had happened. You're making an arrangement, not an alliance, as it turns out. You're just making a cooperative agreement with your worst enemy. It really threw them into a turmoil, and they struggled to try to figure out how to deal with it. And it really wasn't dealt with until Hitler invaded Germany. Then, oh, okay, now we get it. All right, I just want you to be aware of that. All decisions are binding on parties everywhere. Okay. So the point that I'm trying to make is that, like the Declaration of Independence, you have a philosophic foundation to the Bolshevism, communism, and then you have the implementation. It's practicality. How do we actually make this happen? And countries throughout the world were very aware of it. I'm sorry, here we go. So the 14 points, again, I'm not going to read them. It's just a formulation of American ideas and with Wilson's own particular progressivism built in, and the idea that within this system that he's promoting, there can be a League of Nations. Now, on the surface, sounds pretty good. Let's get the nations together. Instead of fighting each other, we just talk out our problems and we'll come to an understanding and a compromise that's workable. But reality bites, because without substantial authority to impose its decisions, as Mao said, political power comes from the barrel of a gun. Without your ability to do that, this kind of formulation will fail. The United States did not even join it. And Wilson had his stroke while out trying to promote not only acceptance of the Treaty of Versailles, but he was out trying to promote the League of Nations, and the people were rejecting them. We don't want another group somewhere out in who knows where telling us how to live and what's our best interest. And that's one of the fundamental problems that still exists within the United Nations today. Okay. I like this comment from Anne Ryan because I think it highlights something extreme, but fundamentally important to us to grasp. Socialism by vote. Now, again, Stalin is alleged to have said, it's not who vote that counts, it's who counts the votes. In our own country, we've had enormous turmoil over the last set of elections, going back all the way to 2000 when Bush was running against Gore. Who counts the votes? What about these hanging chads? You know, false voter records and lack of voter ID or too much requirement to identify yourself and so on and so on and so on. Who counts the votes? Socialism wins by voting. But then the trajectory from the communist standpoint is then socialism will fall into communism. That'll be the next inevitable step. Now, trying to dissect out differences among these philosophies becomes very tricky because different sources will give you different definitions and different concepts. So I do this fairly quickly just to kind of emphasize the complexity of this argument and how it will play out in different formulations as we get into the events of the 20s and 30s and see what the world was coming to. So communism, political movement, state controls means of producing, create a society, everyone's treated equally. What we saw in formulation in Russia was that everyone being treated equally except for the elite, all right? And everybody being equal meant everybody was treated pretty badly. If you ever read stories about what life was like in the apartments and how these apartments were constructed and so on, if you look at some of the economic changes in China currently, and then look at the buildings that they're putting up, and then look at the quality of the building, where you can literally grab a piece of plaster and pull it off with your hand, where people were literally taking empty glass bottles and putting them in the foundation with your so-called rebars, which you as a person could actually bend yourself, and then put this cement down. Now, you can build a lot of stuff that way. How long is it going to stay up? We've already seen what happened in Florida, where we had, meeting our codes, have a building fall down. On the other hand, socialism says, well, it's political and economic, equal share, all right, equal right to a share. It's a little bit different. And the formulation lacks certain definitions and critical points that we may capture a little bit here. According to each person's ability, you get back according to the size of your contribution. Okay, I do more, I get more. No, communism, you work and we decide what you get. We decide your needs. You don't get to decide. You don't get to come to me and say, I need a new coat. I decide if you need a new coat. Okay? And if you've got a coat, I may say, I think he deserves a new one. So enjoy. All right. Whereas in our system, it doesn't work that way. Okay. All right. Now, again, this is something that if you read it down, you'll think, this doesn't sound so bad. All right. Serves the common good without giving up individuality or personality or product of efficiency. Okay. Socialism values the individual, encourages him. Holding his interests as an individual must be in consonance with those of the community. Who decides what's in consonance with the good of the community? If you want to be an entrepreneur and you want to go out and build a new chair, we say, well, look at all the chairs we have. We don't need more chairs. Yes, but this chair will, no, we got plenty of chairs. You see? So in a sense, it says you can do what you wish, provided we think it's necessary. So these terms, which sound very good on the surface, when you come to implementation, begin to get altered. But at the same time, he says, great inventions, discoveries, product of an individual brain. And I think we could agree with that. It's your creativity at work. Again, another iteration that looks past some of the formulations we typically consider. Fascism teaches the state is primary. The individual has no particular ability to survive, much less prosper, without a social structure built around him that is ensured by the state. Now, again, without being too critical, Senator Warren and President Obama said, you didn't build that. Because they recognized that within a modern society, individuals depend upon an enormous infrastructure, roads, communication, access to materials, all those kinds of things that can't exist if you are outside of society. You can go try to live in Alaska and, pick mushrooms. Don't try to live in a bus like that guy did, okay, because it doesn't work. But the point I'm trying to make is that the formulations now take on a different connotation. The formulation, and Mussolini was very clear on this, it's a totalitarian state. That is, we look at the totality of our economics, our culture, everything. And an individual can prosper within that. We can allow certain latitudes, provided it accrues to the value of the state. Because without the state, the individual is nothing. Okay? All right. Now, how did National Socialism change from fascism? It was very similar, and many times people use the words interchangeably. We hear about the anti-fascists in Portland, for example. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're called Antifa, all right? And the idea is, at least as their formulation exists, is that we don't want these organizations ruling over us. On the other hand, the techniques they're using to shut you up can be rather distasteful, I'll put it that way. Nazis took on a slightly different hue. Statism was still a part of it and became increasingly a part of it. Everything accrued to the benefit of the state. The individual was simply a cog in that complex machine. But more importantly, they also began to define race as the key issue in defining the people who would be allowed into the state or allowed to exist within the state. And if you did not participate or were not a part of that ethnic grouping, then you don't belong. Now, again, think of it from this perspective, and I'm not trying to make this sound good or nice. But after World War I, Germany lost an enormous part of its population to surrounding areas. There were many, many Germans living in Alsace and Lorraine. There had been many Germans living in Poland. There had been many Germans living in the environs around what was called Czechoslovakia. In fact, in some places, they were the majority. Now, if we remember back not so long ago, what was the rationalization for Russia taking over part of Eastern Ukraine? Predominant Russian population. So we don't care what the political boundary is. These people are our people. What about what happened even prior to World War I when Serbia got into conflict with Austria-Hungary? Serbia wanted the Serbs who were living within Austria-Hungary to be part of Greater Serbia. We want these ethnic groups homogenized. And if you look at the 14 points, rather paradoxically, that's what Wilson was talking about. And yet when they carved up Europe, they separated out all these ethnic groups, particularly from Germany. So you think now of the Americans, and you may be happy about this, but I'm going to use it as an example, that South Texas and Arizona and New Mexico now belong to Mexico because, you know, that's what it should be. And you think, well, what about all the Americans who live there? Well, tough, you know, live with it. Okay, just as an example. That's probably a poor example. All right, my apologies. Okay. Fascist conception of the state, all embracing, okay, but race was not the issue. And it never really was the issue. During World War II, when the Italians started rounding up some Jews, they were doing that under strong pressure from Germany. If you don't round them up, we're not giving you arms, right? You can't hold on to Ethiopia, you can't hold on to Libya and North Africa and so on. So you damn well better get rid of them, kind of thing. And the same and true in France. But for the fascists themselves, it didn't matter what your ethnic group was. Okay. All right. Now, we're finishing just up, yes, 5 minutes after. I'll stop here. If anyone has any questions, whatever, I don't want to enter into particular debate, because this isn't a matter of my truths somehow forcing you to defend your truths. I'm just trying to present a perspective that I hope will stay with you, not just through these lectures, but give you some pause to think about where we are today, not just even as a nation, but globally, and how ideology, my holding a truth, means I can't compromise with you because I have the truth. The fascists, the Nazis, the Bolsheviks, the United States under its formulation of the Declaration hold certain truths. And therefore, you have to decide, am I going to give those up in order to have something else? And this can get into a deeper philosophic argument. You talk about religion and morality, and from where does morality stem? Do you have free will or not? In actuality, not just politically, it gets very, very complex. But I hope that's part of the purpose of these lectures, to let you think about those things or talk about them among yourselves. Thank you for your time, patience, consideration. Tom, anybody have any questions, or they all fall asleep? Okay. Thank you.